I'm going to be sharing some empirical data from a study that my collaborators and I recently did, and this is some early data we just started analyzing, and this is just going to be a snippet since it's a flash talk. But I'm going to be focusing on some of the data that we collected to help us answer the question, what prevents scientists and engineers from collaborating with philosophers of science? So a common view that we've found, both in the literature, in talking to scientists and philosophers, and in a previous survey that we've done, was that a lot of people assume that the reason that scientists and engineers don't collaborate more with philosophers of science is simply that they're not interested. So my colleagues and I conducted a study in 2019 that looked at this, that found that actually, I think over 90% of philosophers of science were interested in collaborating with scientists and engineers. Almost 70% had already done so in some way. Over 50% had actually co-authored. But when we asked what barriers they perceive most philosophers to face in these collaborations, a lack of interest from scientists was the #1 barrier. Almost half of respondents perceived it to be a major barrier. Now, this makes sense, especially given some of the negative comments that prominent scientists have made about philosophy of science. So we see Stephen Hawking saying, philosophy is dead. Philosophy has not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly physics. Lawrence Krauss tells us that the worst part of philosophy is, in fact, philosophy of science. The only people, as far as I can tell, that read work by philosophers of science are other philosophers of science. It has no impact on physics whatsoever. And just as an aside, I have a couple of other papers with empirical data showing that Lawrence Krauss is actually quite wrong here. And Louis Wolpert, a biologist, says, no scientist that I know of, other than as a sort of dabble, has the slightest interest in the philosophy of science. So I was curious, is this true? So there's a number of questions that my colleagues and I were interested in asking. #1, how pervasive is this apparent lack of interest in collaborating with philosophers of science? And for scientists who haven't collaborated, which we assume is the vast majority of them, what prevents them from doing so? Is it the lack of interest? Is it something else? And how uncommon is it actually for scientists to engage? We make claims all the time that these collaborations never happen. We know from philosophers, surveys of philosophers of science, that they're quite common, but maybe we're just really busy, people, and maybe we're just working with a very small subset of scientists. So we used a mixed methods multi-phase approach where we started by interviewing scientists and engineers who had collaborated with philosophers of science. We interviewed 20 scientists and engineers, but that was from a list of about 100 collaborations that we had found within the course of a day. These were from multiple disciplines and countries. We then used the interview data to design a survey instrument and surveyed scientists and engineers from across 27 Canadian universities. This is all research-intensive universities in Canada, so comprehensive sample. And then we matched that to 27 US universities randomly selected as part of our sampling frame. Our invitation went out to over 20,000 scientists and engineers, and we got the standard 10% response rate. In fact, this may be a higher response rate because about half the emails look like they hadn't been opened and may have gone to spam. So over 2,000 responded to some of the survey questions, over 1,500 to the entire survey. So I'm going to share with you some of the key findings that we had, again, keeping in mind, this is just a snippet, and I'm not going to have time to go through a lot of the details of our analysis or caveats of the limitations, but you can ask me about those things during the break. So first of all, we wanted to know to what extent are scientists' attitudes positive, negative, or largely neutral towards philosophy of science. So we asked everyone in the survey, how would you characterize the influence of philosophy of science on your field? Beneficial, highly beneficial, somewhat beneficial? Are you indifferent? Do you think it's a waste of time? Do you think it's actually actively harmful? I will say that we expected negative views to be somewhere around 20%, positive views to maybe be 20%, and the rest to be indifferent. That was not at all what we found. In fact, all of these responses here in green are positive. Over 75% of respondents had positive views of the influence of philosophy of science on their field as either somewhat or highly beneficial. Less than 4% had negative views. The rest were indifferent. This was really surprising. We then thought, we wonder what they think their colleagues would say. So we said, in your discipline, what do you think your colleagues would say about the influence of philosophy of science in your field, and we found that they judge their colleagues to be more negative than themselves. So everybody else thinks that they are more positive about philosophy of science than the average. I will say, just as an aside, I don't have time to get into the details here, but we took very careful steps to prevent selection bias. Nowhere in the recruitment materials does the word philosophy show up. Nowhere in the informed consent does philosophy show up. The word philosophy doesn't come up till question 7. This is a study about research collaboration, and in fact, a lot of the questions at the beginning are about interdisciplinary collaboration generally. And when we asked about philosophy of science, we asked about other allied fields like sociology and history of science as well, so that it didn't stick out. Okay, we then asked everyone, how interested are you in collaborating with philosophers of science, and defined collaboration in this way. Here we expected, and in fact, in talking to other people at this conference and colleagues, similar expectations that maybe 20% would have been interested in collaborating, maybe 2 or 3 would have actually collaborated. Again, not at all what we found. 70% expressed interest in collaborating. So 10%, almost 10%, 9.4%, actually said they had collaborated in these more formal ways. I'll get to informal collaboration or informal engagements in a minute, with philosophers of science. 60% expressed interest but had not yet collaborated, and 30% were not interested. We then asked those who expressed interest in collaborating but hadn't yet done so that's 60% here, wanted to know more from them, why they hadn't. What were the major reasons that you had not yet collaborated with a philosopher of science? And we asked about things like lack of funding, philosophers don't know enough science, there aren't enough journals where we can publish, it's not going to be valued in tenure and promotion, I don't know any philosophers, et cetera, et cetera. And again, we found the responses here were not what we were expecting. The number one reason that they said they had not collaborated is simply, I don't know any philosophers of science. That was 72.5%. Next was not enough funding, then not enough time, but this is where it gets really interesting. 48% said that they hadn't collaborated because they lack philosophical background. When we asked them, do they think that a reason they haven't collaborated is that philosophers lack scientific background, only 6% answered that. That was the least common reason. So in fact, back to some of the conversations from yesterday, when we think about, some people talk about how, scientists expect philosophers to learn the science, but don't themselves think they need to learn the philosophy. In fact, I think a lot of scientists, and we saw this in our interviews, are quite intimidated by the literature and philosophy of science, and intimidated by trying to find a way to break in. And I can say more about that in conversations during the break. Okay. Let me just note too, 1/3 of the respondents also took the time to fill in open-ended responses, elaborating on their answers. I say a little bit more about that later on. We then asked everyone, not just those who were interested in collaborating. So this was all of the all of the people that responded, whether or not they were interested in collaborating. In what ways have you engaged with a philosopher of science, even formally? And this allowed us to see to what extent formal collaborations are really happening. We saw 9.4% versus informal engagements. And here we thought, okay, if we see about 10% of scientists collaborating in formal ways, which actually, as an aside, let me just say, that's incredibly huge. If we think about the size of scientific and engineering communities, 10% of scientists and engineers are saying that they have collaborated with philosophers of science in these more formal ways. And think about how many of us there are. I know at my institution, we dominate in philosophy of science. There's 5 of us, right? It's huge. And there's hundreds of scientists and engineers. So I will just say we should pat ourselves on the back because we're incredibly busy people. But you'll see in a minute, we're even busier than you think. Because when we asked in what ways have you engaged with a philosopher of science even formally, almost 50% said that they have had informal conversations with philosophers of science about the research. So direct face-to-face interaction. They've invited philosophers of science to attend lab meetings, solicited input on their work, served on graduate students' committees together, et cetera, et cetera. Not surprisingly, Co-authoring scholarly publications is the lowest here because, of course, as we can imagine, the barriers are the highest. So in our interviews, we actually looked at these barriers, which include things like writing norms. Scientists would say, I have no idea when a philosophy of science paper is done. And I said, neither do we. Why do you think it takes so long to publish? But of course, the speed of publication came up as one of the barriers as well in terms of collaborating and co-authoring papers together. So we also found, I'll just add here in our interviews, that the collaborations, even more formal collaborations, oftentimes were very meaningful for scientists, but didn't always result in co-authored publications, which is why citation analyses really, although they can point to some things, don't give us enough information about these collaborations. So that's why we actually did this mixed method study. Okay, so one of the things I also want to notice here is that more dialogical modes of engagement seem to be more common, right? So informal conversations about your research, inviting a philosopher of science to come to a talk, et cetera, whereas these more textual modes are less common. And I will add, though, what's really interesting is that during the interviews, we found that the ways a lot of the collaborations got started were from these more dialogical interactions. So they're really worthwhile in terms of even getting to formal collaborations, but also they can be quite impactful for scientists and engineers, even if it's a 20-minute conversation. Okay, so I do want to add an important finding from our interviews, because a lot of times when I share this research with other philosophers of science, the response tends to be, one of the things about these collaborations is that not only do scientists, expect us to know all the science and don't care about knowing philosophy, which, as it turns out, might not be the case, but they see it as unidirectional. We're there to be in the service of science, right? And so in our interviews, we actually didn't ask specifically about this, but spontaneously, many of the people we interviewed made a point to say that they were invested in seeing their collaboration with philosophers of science as mutually beneficial. They did not view philosophy of science as being merely in service of the science, and in fact talked a lot about how they were really careful to make sure that the work they were doing was helping to advance their colleagues, their philosopher of science collaborator's career. So one person asked, I wanted to know, had I contribute to my collaborator? Hope they did. I hope I can be effective in helping them think through the way their book might be themed. And then several other, these are just a couple of the quotes. Participants talked about the ways in which they became more aware of the barriers in philosophy of science and tried to help their collaborators navigate that. Okay. So what does this tell us then? What prevents scientists and engineers from collaborating with philosophers? It doesn't seem to be primarily a lack of interest in collaborations, at least not from what the scientists and engineers tell us. Of course, we know from social studies of science and just sociology in general that what views people endorse and what they actually do in their actions might not always align. But at least that's not what we're seeing here. Rather, the key barriers included not knowing any philosophers of science, and interestingly, in the open-ended responses, we saw people saying, I know some famous philosophers of science, or I know of their work, but they would not want to hear from me. Or I've tried to reach out to a couple of philosophers of science, and they didn't seem interested. So there is a concern that some scientists have that we would not actually be interested in working with them. Other key barriers included lack of funding, time, or philosophical background. And in the open-ended responses elaborating on these, respondents talked about institutions not incentivizing these collaborations and science colleagues not valuing them. That last part of science colleagues not valuing them was a huge finding in our interview data, and we've got a paper that's about to go in our submission specifically on that and about sort of the dominant ways of thinking within science and how it makes it harder for scientists who want to collaborate to do so. So in conclusion, these common beliefs about scientists' negative attitudes do not align with the empirical data. So Hawking and Krauss and Wolpert and others do not speak for most scientists and engineers. And this, of course, suggests that we may need different types of interventions to foster fruitful collaborations, like networking events. And so this is something our research team is working on. Now that we've finished the interviews and surveys, our next phase of our project is to start creating a toolkit and ways to have help foster these collaborations. And in fact, I'll also just point out in conclusion that this informal engagement that we saw is quite common and can be a starting point for these collaborations. Thank you.
Thank you. This is wonderful. I just want to report a talk that I recently heard, and that seems to be somewhat contrary to the results you presented. It's from Thijs Ringelberg and Helena Slanickova. They did with a much smaller sample and then in a more qualitative way. And they found much more negative views of scientists and social scientists toward philosophers. On the one hand, a doubt on the part of the scientists whether there are any clear standards and methods in philosophy, and then a more cultural factor, as they called it, and I took a picture of that slide because I found it so funny. It's the summary. Philosophers aren't perceived as very nice to interact with. Participants described philosophy and philosophers as arrogant, critical, and argumentative. And these were the reasons to stay away from philosophers and from the discipline.
Yeah.
And they also have a plan to test different methods to overcome those ideas, but I think that's still in the planning phase. So
yeah.
if you don't know their work, maybe it's good to interact with
I don't know
them.
it, but I'll follow up with you so I can look at it and see methodologically might be different. It could be that we're looking, I'm not sure what country they're looking at, or what fields in particular. But what was interesting to me is that, I mean, I've heard that anecdotally from a few scientists and engineers, and I have heard some scientists and engineers say that's been their experience, but they've moved on and then found other philosophers of science that were fantastic to work with. So, fortunately, they didn't let that color their perception too much. But what's interesting is I was looking through all of the open-ended responses today, and not a lot of scientists and engineers talked about that. So I don't know why. It'd be interesting to look at the samples and see maybe what is differing there. So thanks for calling that to my attention.
Thanks, Katie. This is not only extremely cool work, but also in a way a service to the profession. So thank you for that. This is just really like an invitation for you to say more about the different responses that were listed, that were available to choose from in terms of why scientists aren't collaborating more with philosophers. So should we understand that as, or in what way should we understand that as reflecting the state of the relevant literature? Or was there quite a lot of original contribution in coming up with these available options?
Yeah, so these options are based on a number of things. Number one, some of the literature on interdisciplinary studies and common barriers to interdisciplinary collaboration. Number two, some of this was based on the interviews and surveys that we did with philosophers of science. And then number three, this was based on the interviews we did with scientists and engineers, and the kinds of things they were saying, but also the things they were saying that their colleagues were telling them about why they hadn't collaborated. Because what's interesting about the people we interviewed is not only did they have experience collaborating, but then they would have these conversations with their colleagues and say, and then say like, oh yeah, have you ever thought about working with a philosopher of science? So they're really interesting informants. So these options were all sort of informed by those different literature and studies. And then in addition, we had the open-ended responses specifically to see kind of what we missed. But I will say that the open-ended responses, there weren't things that were coming up over and over again that weren't already represented here. It was just a deeper elaboration of this, or maybe things like instead of I don't know any, it's more I don't know any that I think would be interested.
Thanks so much. So super quick empirical question about what was the difference between people's perception of philosophy versus history and social science, because you mentioned that you had asked something of the kind in the survey. But also, I was wondering, there is a big discrepancy between your findings and what has been my experience and that of many colleagues. And I don't think it's due to people being like hostile to philosophy per se, but to a relationship that sometimes can be very instrumental, where what scientists perceive to be our role is very, very different from, of course, how we would conceptualize it. So I was wondering whether you have anything in the survey that looked at what they meant by philosophy or what they understood by that kind of work. Is it like, we have a bit of ethics and it's really nice to have it, or is it something more substantive?
We actually asked a question, how confident are you in your understanding of what philosophy of science is? And then open-ended question, can you please define philosophy of science for me? We've just started analyzing it, so I can't give you answers to that. There was more confidence than we thought. What I can say is, having read through those responses very quickly, I was surprised actually at how, like, there were more that were pretty accurate than I was expecting. And I thought a lot would talk about ethics, but there was a lot that were addressing things like epistemic and, issues and sort of methodological reflections and looking at assumptions, which really surprised me. There were also a few here and there that were like, there was a couple that were like, Wikipedia defines philosophy of science as. So that was great to see. But yeah, so more to come as we analyze that. And I can't remember what the differences were with sociology of science, but I can check and give you that. Yeah.